Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Chair Yellen, for being with us today. In 2013, there were 12 banks, as I understand it, that controlled 69% of the industry assets. And I think we've been seeing a market increase in the share of revenues concentrated in a relatively small handful of firms. I see you're nodding. I assume that means you would not disagree with that.
I believe that's true.
And then there was the economic census of 2012, and we learned from that study that there were some 33,000 fewer business establishments in the finance and insurance industry than there were in 2007. So over that 5-year period, we saw 33,000 business entities that left the market or were consolidated into something else. I think it's worth evaluating the potential problems that an increasingly concentrated and potentially less competitive banking sector might pose, especially in light of some of the concerns surrounding the too big to fail concern. So let me ask you this, Chair Yellen, what risks do you see that might come from the concentration of power, the concentration of market share within the financial industry? What risk do you think that might pose to our overall financial stability?
So large, interconnected, complex firms, it's not just a question of size, but size is part of it, but other characteristics matter too. Their distress or failure could pose significant risks to financial stability, and a great deal of our regulatory and supervisory response since the financial crisis has been directed at those firms that do pose such systemic risks. And we have imposed much higher capital standards and capital standards for individual firms that reflect our assessment of the individual risks that each of those systemic firms poses to our financial system. Because of the risks they pose, they need to have a lower probability of distress, to be better managed, have more liquidity, to have resolution plans, that we need to make sure these entities are resolvable and diminish their risk of failing. And we have, through our stress tests and capital requirements, resolution plans, living wills, and other things, have improved the safety and soundness, especially of those institutions.
Let's talk about those efforts for a minute. You mentioned stress tests in particular. Since the enactment of Dodd-Frank and over the last few years, the Fed has undertaken various measures, some of which you referred to, of regulatory enforcement. I wonder whether some of those efforts might undermine the due process interests of those who own the banks, not just the banks themselves, not just the wealthy people who are invested in them, but also the many people, including retirees, who invest in them. A longstanding concern of due process involves certainty in the law. James Madison described this in Federalist 62 when he said that the people, it'll be of little avail to the people that their laws may be written by individuals of their own choosing if those laws be so voluminous, complex, and ever-changing that they cannot be understood, or if they undergo such incessant changes that no person who knows what the law is today can be sure what it will be tomorrow. My understanding of these stress tests is that the standards are constantly changing, and there's kind of a black box. And so they don't know what the law is today, and they know even less about what the law will be tomorrow. If by the law we mean the standards enforceable by the Fed that carry the force of law will be. How is that consistent with due process, and how can the lack of transparency be consistent with our time-honored standards of due process.
So I would disagree that there's a lack of transparency. While we do not publish the precise mathematical formulas that are used to evaluate bank portfolios, we have published and shared with the industry a great deal of information about the models that we use. We
A
have
great deal of information about them, but that doesn't mean that they know what the models are. And the models themselves are the basis for legal standards to which they're subject, are they not?
We want these banking organizations to have sound risk management, and that means developing their own capacity to evaluate the risks in their portfolios rather than using a model that we hand them. And the GAO review of our stress testing did not recommend, they looked at this very carefully, and they did not recommend that we share with the industry the exact details of the model. We have put out for public comment policies about how we design stress test scenarios. The industry understands how we go about devising those scenarios, although they change from time to time, and they have a great deal of information about the models that we use and what's contained in it. But we want to make sure that they have appropriate incentives to analyze their own unique risks of those organizations that may not be captured in our stress test, and that they build models that are appropriate for each individual firm.
Okay, my time's expired, and I've got to respect the clock and the chairman and my fellow committee members. I do want to point out that GAO did, in fact, recommend updating, revising the guidance. And I also want to be clear that I understand you've got a difficult job to do, and I understand these are very important things. But I don't think we can overlook the fact simply because something's important doesn't mean that we can subject the American people to laws that are constantly subject to change, laws that are not even written by individuals of their own choosing, laws written by people who are unelected and therefore unaccountable to the people. Doesn't mean they have bad intentions. It just means that there can be no due process in that environment, and I think we've got to take that into account. We need to be very mindful of that and look for ways to reform it. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator.